In the study that I conducted for publication in 2009, one of the participants was delivered to the study abroad site by her mother. She was then visited by her father, by her brother, by her boyfriend, and by her sister, such that out of the 16 weeks that she spent in the town where she was supposedly integrating and learning French, she was on her own for maybe half the time. Abroad is not as abroad as it used to be.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. I'm Dan Gable, Technology Manager for the LRC. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language, Celeste Kinginger, Professor of Applied Linguistics at Penn State University, joins our podcast to discuss what helps and hinders advancing language proficiency while studying abroad, including social interactive and pragmatic aspects of language acquisition. Celeste also provides advice for students and instructors to make the most of their time abroad.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. It is my pleasure today to welcome Celeste Kinginger to our show. Dr. Kinginger is professor of applied linguistics at the Pennsylvania State University and is at Cornell as part of our LRC speaker series. She gave a talk last week titled Language Learning in Intercultural Encounters Abroad, and we will extend our conversations about language learning abroad on our podcast. Welcome to Speaking of Language, Celeste.
Thank you very much, Angelica. It's a pleasure to be here.
So today we would like to talk a little bit more about language learning abroad. But before we get started, can you share with our listeners a little bit about your own background, the research that you do?
Yes, of course. I've been involved in language acquisition research since I finished my PhD at the University of Illinois in 1989. Mm-hmm. And in the early years, I worked on classroom discourse research and teacher education research to some extent. I was involved in the early years of the approach we now call telecollaboration, which involves putting together classes on both sides of in my case, in both sides of the Atlantic. Yeah. My learners of French would have a partner class in France consisting of learners of English, and we designed materials and activities for both of those groups to work together using some of the earlier technological tools that were available at the time. And then I think it was about 16 years ago that at Penn State we received our first grant from the United States Department of Education's Title VI program for National Foreign Language Resource Centers. Yeah. And the theme of our resource center is advanced language proficiency, education, and development. Yeah. So I decided at the beginning of that process that one of the things that would interest me most, I've always been interested in environments for language learning and how context affects the process and the outcome. So I launched my first project at that point on study abroad. That was a it was a medium-scale empirical study that involved a mixed methods investigation of language learning and life histories of about 23 students from Penn State who were studying abroad in France, and was published as the very first modern language journal monograph in 2008. And then, as I was working on that first empirical project, I began to gather all of the literature that I could find on the topic of language learning in study abroad. And my literature review outgrew its original function. Sure. And became a separate book, which was a critical overview of language learning in those contexts. We continued to get funding for another. Those were the first 2 4-year cycles. In the third, I requested and received funding to study how languages are learned in mealtime socialization practices. In that case, it was a group of high school students learning Chinese. And with myself and my research assistant doctoral students. I had the great good fortune of having research assistants who also became my doctoral advisees.
Nice.
Yeah, we have been carrying out studies in that context for some time now, including the 2 dissertations. And now I am still working on those data. I'm also collecting similar data in collaboration with the Dickinson in France Study Abroad Center. I'm going back to my original interest in French language socialization.
Nice.
That project is underway. And alongside that project, I also have another grant from the U.S. Department of Education to conduct a nationwide survey of alumni of study abroad programs who still have proficiency in a language other than English, and who also did international education experiences at some point during their education. So, and that's happening when the survey is complete. My next step will be to gather life history interviews from about 60 people of varying ages, working in different employment sectors, and with just different life stories to see if I can gather enough material to write a book for the general public about that experience and its impact on careers.
Interesting. So. Those are fascinating projects. I guess you know how to keep yourself busy.
I seem to be allergic to working on less than 2 or 3 things at the same time. So,
multitasking at its best. I like it. So if we look at students who are studying abroad, specifically at their language development, what are some of the factors that keep students from advancing their language proficiency while they're abroad, and maybe also while they're on campus in regular language classes? What are some of the things that you've seen in your research?
In terms of the study abroad setting, probably the most important thing that I notice about contemporary study abroad is that students are not there. That is, they go where they're going, but for various reasons, they're not engaged in the local activities that are available to them at the location where they're supposed to be getting involved in communicative practices, let's say. And that's for various reasons. One is that we have now the capability to surround ourselves with our own communicative, personalized environment. This was not the case in the past. And I know there's a great deal of hand-wringing and lamentation amongst people of my generation about this, because I remember in particular, one of my most intensive language learning study abroad experiences was working on a small farm in southern France for a summer in a town where there was one telephone. And people didn't actually believe it worked. So for long distance calls, there were no speakers of English. There was no access to English anywhere in my environment. Whereas nowadays, it's really easy to stay very much connected to one's home and one's own social network from home. There's not as much impetus to integrate with the local communities as there once was. That's certainly the case. Also, there's some students' motives for studying abroad are, we as language acquisition researchers will assign them an identity as language learners when in fact that's really not why they're abroad. They're there to gather cultural capital. Signs of, developing a middle-brow consumerist lifestyle. They travel a lot while they're abroad in order to collect memories of significant monuments that they've seen, that sort of thing. So there's their travel is a lot easier for everyone. And so we also find that students who go abroad now are frequently accompanied physically by members of their own families or their home-based social networks. In the study that I conducted for publication in 2009, one of the participants was delivered to the study abroad site by her mother.
Oh, wow.
She was then visited by her father, by her brother, by her boyfriend, and by her sister, such that for long periods of time, such that out of the 16 weeks that she spent in the town where she was supposedly integrating and learning French, she was on her own for maybe half the time.
Wow.
So that's another issue, I guess.
Yeah, sure. That will have a big impact on just immersing yourself in the language and in the culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so abroad is not as abroad as it used to be.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And I think students who are sincere about learning a foreign language really need to foreground their identities as language learners.
Yeah.
There's also, of course, the spread of English as a lingua franca, which makes it, for Anglophone students, that provides an extra set of challenges for two reasons. One of them is that English as a lingua franca is the preferred medium for interaction amongst groups of students in many international settings. And the other reason, which is the findings on this are just beginning to emerge, but we suspect that students who are speakers of English or other world languages like Spanish or French and who have not had significant experiences of struggle to communicate in another language are poor speakers of the lingua franca version of their language. So you can go abroad as a speaker of English and be a poor speaker of English as a lingua franca and therefore become a dispreferred interlocutor and be excluded from
Interesting.
social groups abroad because you lack the empathy.
Of course.
You pepper your talk with baseball metaphors and that sort of thing, or you haven't thought enough about what the difficulties are that people experience when they're encountering someone with unexamined native capabilities.
Do you have some advice for teachers who lead study abroad programs or even individuals who prepare students for study abroad programs on what they can tell students to make the most of their time abroad?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I think there are various levels of advice one might provide. Some of the most exciting research that I've seen lately comes from a program called the LangSnap program. It's a British project that followed 50-some Anglophone British speakers of learners of French and Spanish over several years. Now, I believe I'm not quite sure how far along it is now, but it's becoming a longitudinal project. And they measured all manner of aspects of language proficiency and other learning dimensions surrounding that. But they also had a significant qualitative component to their study. And their findings were that, first of all, if you look at the gainers, the ones who made the most progress, what you find is that these are people who have a clear vision of themselves as multilinguals. They're in their imagination. There's an appealing vision of the self as a speaker of another language. They are also people who are resilient. So they come in. Many students who embark on study abroad for language learning purposes have some ideals that they have specific things that they think they would like. They would like particularly to develop friendships. Often that's a very common thing that students say. That doesn't always happen.
Sure.
But there are many other ways in which you can become involved in local communities. So the gainers in this study were the ones who were resilient about that. They would accept whatever opportunities were given to them to become engaged members of their community and therefore get many opportunities to interact and learn from local inhabitants. The other thing that they found was that these successful students had they allowed themselves to develop some sort of emotional attachment to at least one person in their environment. And it doesn't seem to matter who that person is.
Okay.
It could be a friend, it could be a host parent, it could be a teacher, it could be a supervisor at work, it could be members of a team that they joined to do sports or what have you. But those who had developed some sort of strong affective connection, and that means in order to do that means that you have to be where you are.
Sure.
You have to be in the location that you have selected and not waste your time so to speak,
Yeah.
or lose, in terms of language learning, it is a waste of time, I think, to spend a good portion of your study abroad period, especially if it's short, traveling to other locations, as I was discussing earlier. In terms of the one of the things that surprises me about study abroad programs is that they are under considerable pressures from all the different angles, all the different parties who have an interest in this. So their curricula have to mesh with the curricula of the home
Of course.
schools.
Yeah.
And this pushes them more often than I think should be the case towards not recognizing within their curricula the value of the local environment. So I feel strongly that study abroad language curricula should involve projects that take advantage of the environment.
Yeah.
Maybe investigations of the linguistic landscape or small ethnographic projects that students have to do, and maybe even, structured conversations. It's hard for me to recommend that because I fundamentally don't like the idea of turning to a student saying, go have a structured conversation. But if students are having a hard time making connections with their host family, for instance, then the programs, I think, should intervene to give the student a strong reason to initiate that conversation. Sure. And also, I think the best programs that I've seen are programs that do intervene when there's conflict taking place in homestays or other living environments, and provide a locus for mediation and discovery of what's going on. Because very often, study abroad participants are there. Not very often, almost always, they are novice participants in the environments that they're frequenting, so they don't, by definition, understand what the motivations of their interlocutors are.
Of course.
And can leap to conclusions way before one should. So that's another investment that the profession could make to improve these experiences as language learning experiences. Although, I know it's difficult that the resources frequently are not available.
Sure.
Right.
Do you think we can somehow take advantage of the fact that our students are so tapped into their social networks through their phones or computers while they are abroad, and somehow turn that around so that they can engage more deeply in the target culture with the target language?
That should be the one of the major projects for the profession, I think, coming up, that we need to see if we can, especially if we can work on engaging students before they go abroad in learning about the environment that they're frequenting, learning about images of their country in the places that they're visiting, so that they're prepared to see and hear the kinds of things that are said about their country, in this case, the United States. Also, I think that the telecollaborative classroom has a lot of potential for setting students up to have prior experience in interacting with people who are not in a professorial role.
That's a good point,
and maybe in having conversations that have some consequences for their self-image, and also getting exposed to the varieties of language that people actually use.
Yep, true.
I know it's certainly the case for the languages that I have used and taught and have been exposed to, that the textbook version
very different from what you actually encounter when you're abroad.
Yeah, and it's, well, in the case of French, there's a long history of linguistic insecurity that stands in the way of there being any kind of easy resolution to this problem, because, well, any traditionally, at least, even very expert speakers of French will pass judgment on other very expert speakers of French because they're very focused on what's pure and true and correct about the language, and that also then is applied to learners by teachers and even by native speaking hosts and such that they don't get a chance to deal with the fact that the real language that people use in informal situations, regardless of how educated they are, does not correspond to the sanctioned version. So I think getting just a taste of that, and understanding that, some of the frustration you may feel in the first week or two may stem from the fact that you have not been learning the same variety of the language that is practiced in informal settings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So one other area that you've done a lot of research on is pragmatic aspects of language. Can you briefly talk about some of the differences that we encountered trying to teach these social, interactive, and pragmatic aspects in traditional classrooms, and then the disconnect similar to what you just talked about with students encountering different varieties maybe of the target language once they're abroad?
Well, yeah, that's easy. We certain dispositions are not allowed in the classroom. Most of the classroom language that we encounter has been sanitized to some degree, if not entirely. So there are whole registers that are important for students to know if they want to develop advanced proficiency. You need to know you need to understand the entire range. You need to understand the lower, so to speak, aspects, registers of the language, as well as the sort of medium neutral ones and the very, very elevated ones. And you need to understand that, for instance, if you speak in a very bookish, elevated style, it can be interpreted as sarcasm, or there's a whole lot of language awareness that needs to happen for students to develop advanced proficiency. And again, I'm working with this center, which has a focus on advanced proficiency, so we think about these things all the time. So there's that fact that it's unseemly to represent certain aspects of languages in the classroom. So you can have ersatz performances of strong emotions, and you can have media-based representations of strong emotions in the classroom, but you're not going to have actual strong emotions. The student is not going to encounter someone who is genuinely angry with them. And expressing it in a way that is unseemly for the classroom. So that's part of the problem. And yet, that this is really necessary. So, and apart from that, again, we see, for instance, that students can develop great fluency in classrooms, and especially in domestic immersion programs. But if you make a mistake, if you're at a domestic immersion program, for instance, and you make a mistake in, ordering, you still get your lunch.
Sure.
And you still get something that is not going to scare you or frighten you or put you off. So the wonderful thing about life outside the classroom in L2 land, as Jim Coleman used to say, is that you have these interactions that actually have consequences, and that's hard to reproduce in any engineered environment. And it's best for learning pragmatics, because pragmatics is at the intersection between what we call pragmalinguistics and sociopragmatics, right? So you have your resources, you have your forms, and you also have your application of those forms to the performance, the appropriate performance of whatever action you want to perform. And there is some interesting work on teaching this through concept-based instruction, but that's for a different podcast.
Yeah.
I don't think that it's easy to really convey to students in any a priori educational setting, that you can cause serious misunderstandings. Even if you're doing it with full awareness, and for your own purpose, you may not fully understand what it means to use a particular form, how it is locally interpreted, what the norm is for that interpretation locally. So you can only really get that from having a series of real-life experiences.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I have so many more questions, and there's so much more that we could talk about, but we are about out of time here. So I would like to thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, thank you. You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Wonderful. Next week, we will look at one way to maximize intercultural encounters for language and culture learning on campus. I will speak with Melina Draper, Associate Director of Inclusive Teaching in Cornell's Center for Teaching Innovation. We will talk about an exciting initiative that is currently underway on our campus, the Cornell Portal. It is part of a global public art initiative that uses immersive audiovisual technology to connect with people in other portals across the U.S. and also around the world. If you want to check it out before our next episode, the gold-painted shipping container is located just outside of Olin Library on the Art Squad. Until next week, auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter. Speaking of Language is produced by Sam Lupowitz and Dan Gable. Recorded by Sam Lupowitz. Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson. Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University. As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University. We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.